Welcome everyone to Meditation Mount and this session of View from the Mount. And our theme today is preparing for inner birth, healing the wounds of collective trauma. So this is going to be a group journey. Therefore, it's probably best that we start with gathering ourselves together from the different parts of the world and creating a receptive field into which new wisdom and understanding can flow as we inquire the way together. So let's take a few deep, gentle breaths. And we begin by relaxing any tensions in our physical body. Breathing out any stress. Breathing in a sense of deep relaxation. And now we focus on our emotions. And as we breathe out, we release anything that may be swirling. And we breathe in a sense of calmness, so that the troubled waters of the emotions can become like a still lake. And we focus now on the mind, and we breathe out any extraneous thoughts. We breathe in a sense of deep peace and serenity, so that the mind is free and clear. And from this place of relaxation, we gently enter the loving space of our own heart. And we come into contact with a presence of love that burns as a flame at its center. And we feel the warmth and see the glow of this fire of love. And then we sense the many hearts connected on this call. We see lines of lighted love weaving together every heart to form the chalice of our group heart. We are now prepared to take our journey. Thank you. So some of you are aware that this year at Meditation Mount, we focused on two themes, hope and healing. We've been considering fiery hope as an eternal promise that the inherent goodness of our common humanity will eventually show up on earth. And then healing is necessary to prepare the soil and create the right conditions to receive, quicken, and grow these seeds of hope that contain the promise of a more just and joyful world. So today, we are really looking at the healing aspect as a way of creating the right conditions for the next birth which is the birth of the fire of love within the cave of the human heart. So healing the wounds of collective trauma is a topic that's showing up with more and more regularity. And there are people with far greater expertise than I possess who understand how to diagnose and begin the healing process. I'm thinking of people like Thomas Hübl, the German-born spiritual teacher, or the Canadian Dr. Gabor Mate, and then Dr. Marty K. Casey, who is the founder of the Ungun Institute here in the US. And Dr. Marty was a guest on our May 16th Signs of Hope broadcast. And so you can go and look at the recording and understand the work that she's doing of using the performing arts and the arts as a way of healing collective trauma. And we will be posting links about these people I've just named in the chat. So when we remain traumatized, it's extremely difficult to see, to feel, to acknowledge the truth and the beauty of our own and other people's essential divinity. You could say that a body suffering from the shockwaves of trauma does not clearly hear the song of the soul. There's a lot of static, there's a lot of distortion in the field. And none of this is good or bad, it just is. These are the prevailing conditions. And we are here to change the conditions, to create a field that can not only hear the song of the soul, but that can bring it into manifestation. So our task is healing the long-standing wounds inside our collective psyche. And these are wounds that go back millennia, that are still carried forward, because anything that isn't redeemed and healed is carried forward to the next generation or into our next lifetime. So the healing of these wounds will liberate us from the bondage of the past and will help fashion what I would say is a compassionate and caring society where we honor the sacredness of all life and we dare to live and love authentically as one human family. And Dr. Marty, in the conversation we had with her a few weeks ago, she made the comment that hurt people hurt and healed people heal, emphasizing the importance to bring healing. Otherwise, if I'm still hurting, then my only response to a situation will to be cause hurt if that is still the dominant emotion in me. So breaking the negative cycle of cruelty is really what's up. We need to take responsibility for the healing of our own wounds individually, but also collectively, so that we can create conducive conditions for the birth of our true nature. So this is the birth that we're talking about, the birth of the fire of love within. Some people call it the birth of the indwelling divinity or God immanent. So the intent with today's View from the Mount is to place this topic into a broader context and into a deeper dimension of meaning from the perspective of the ageless wisdom teaching that forms the lineage and roots of the work of Meditation Mount. And also, if you have any comments or questions or things come up as we proceed, then please post them in the chat and we'll incorporate them into our group exploration as best as we can. Because I'm not here as an expert on the subject. I'm here like you as somebody who is faced with healing their own trauma, participating in the healing of the collective trauma, preparing the field for the promise of this great birth that awaits us all, the birth of this presence of love that is seeking to enter into our heart, not just as individuals, but into our collective heart. At Meditation Mount, every 2 months, we focus on a particular pathway or principle. And from April the 21st to June the 20th, we are meditating and reflecting on the pathway we call right human relations. So that's very apt to have that today, because right human relations is right relations with self, with others, and the whole of life. So let me place in a few sentences the theme of healing collective trauma inside the larger spiritual context. The ageless wisdom teaching says that we as humanity, for the first time in our history, are approaching a collective test, a collective opportunity to break free from the hold of materialism. In the Bible, it really is that phrase that says we cannot live by bread alone. So we are faced at the moment with a crisis in the world that is asking us to move from being self-centered to a place where we care for others, we care for each other. We're being asked to open the compassionate heart. And the reason is that the compassionate heart is the womb of the spiritual birth of this fire of love. So first we have to address the issues facing us in order to create the conditions for the birth. And we have what I would call the scourge of collective trauma that's been handed down generation to generation, and we've added to it. And we're realizing now the effects of this trauma, because trauma stymies the creativity of the human spirit. And this past year, many people have experienced with COVID lockdowns added stress, added pressure. And I can say that we all share this common field, this traumatic field. And so how do we help each other come to terms with it and bring healing to it? So the idea is that post-traumatic learning leads to healing and liberation. The long-term goal is integrating the painful past into a trauma-free present so that the longed-for future may show up here and now in its full glory. That's the ideal that we're holding. Because we know where there is ease and joy in life, there is no trauma. Things are flowing. Where there is trauma, where there is pain and stress, things become compressed and pressurized. And where there is pain and traumatic stress beyond the reach of our awareness, where it's not consciously being registered, then we're unable to do anything about it and we become sidelined by these emotions. So I would just ask us to stop just for a moment and reflect. What are we aware of? What are you and what am I aware of that causes stress and is traumatizing me? Am I aware of anything? Do I know what I need to work on? What is my relationship with this particular state of being whenever I encounter it, or whenever it seems to take over me? It could be COVID-related trauma. It could be something from years ago. The invitation really is to approach the scared, frozen, and often fearful self that is traumatized with care and compassion so that it gradually can be embraced and the light of our soul's love may release its dark hold on our life. So we know that a strongly overwhelming experience is met with a mechanism in our body, a protective mechanism. So trauma really represents an overwhelming shock to the system that we hadn't yet processed. Once again, there's nothing wrong, good or bad about it. We haven't made any mistakes. We could have done things differently, but hopefully we heal and we learn. And what we learn is that we need to create conditions that are trauma-free. So trauma is transferable. If I still have some trauma in my system and I encounter a traumatic situation with other people involved, it triggers in me all that is unresolved. And instead of being of help, I may add to the trauma by my reaction, which is what Dr. Marty said: hurt people hurt, heal people heal. So we could say that trauma has become normalized and built into our structures because each of us was born into a fragmented and traumatized field called world society. So our soul incarnates with both dharmic and karmic responsibilities. It comes in to carry out the work of giving of its gifts, and it comes in to redeem some of the aspects that still need to be cleared up. But it doesn't come into a clean field to do this. It comes into a field that is still conditioned. And why we are focusing so much on the healing of the collective wounds and the collective trauma is because the field needs to be deconditioned from trauma so that the power and presence of the human spirit can show up authentically, rather than we going into protective survival mode. Thomas Hubel, who I named earlier, who I find to be a great teacher in this arena, he said, when something traumatic happens in my life, it becomes my spiritual practice. It doesn't oppose my spiritual practice. Because some people say, look, I want to lead a spiritual life, but I've got to deal with this. No, dealing with this is part of the spiritual practice of being incarnate. Dharma and karma wrapped together in one package that we brought in. So as I said, the unconscious energy and unredeemed patterns are passed on to the next generation, and we carry them with us into our next incarnation. So you could say, what are we passing on to this next generation? Unless we can heal what's in front of us. So I realize that this is a very sensitive subject because it's not an intellectual conversation we're having. We're talking about living inside a human field of emotions, of feelings. We're talking about how to honor at the same time as we're honoring the pain that we feel. How do we honor the beauty that is the truth of who we are, that is seeking to show up in every moment, and yet is blocked from doing that because of the effects of trauma? I believe that we're all familiar with the acronym PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's been an emerging theme these past number of years as more people come to terms with the debilitating emotional and mental instability that's caused by shocking events. And I'm recalling that I first saw PTSD at an early age without realizing until much later that this is what I was witnessing. My grandfather lived with us for the final years of his life. My grandfather, as a 17-year-old boy, was a stretcher bearer in France with the British Army during the First World War, and he saw and experienced many horrific scenarios. His task was simple, was to carry the dead and wounded from the battlefield strapped to donkeys. And that's what he did. And those scenes of carnage haunted him till the day he died. and it wasn't recognized as PTSD. People didn't acknowledge it. You expected to get on with it. And in Britain, as you know, we're expected to grin and bear it and keep a stiff upper lip, which basically means you repress your emotions and never show that you're hurting, because real men don't cry. Now, that is not the way to bring about healing. And nowadays, PTSD is treated very, very differently. But I just give that example of there are many people walking around who are traumatized, but society didn't recognize they were traumatized. For instance, we have many vets, Vietnam vets and vets from the other wars, who are walking around traumatized, walking around with PTSD. Some of them are homeless, having mental issues. And yet we're not quite sure how to handle it because it's so painfully intimate. Because first we have to admit that we may also be traumatized. So we have to pour the balm of our own healing, love, and compassion on ourselves as well as others. So when trauma shows up, there's a wide range of emotions, from getting angry and losing control to going silent and withdrawing into a protective psychic shell. So fight or flight shows up in various ways. Some of you may be familiar with Otto Scharmer. He wrote Theory U. He also wrote a wonderful book on presencing. And recently I read an interview in which he spoke about the effects of trauma, and he refers to something that he calls absencing. And he believes, as does Thomas Hübl, that the key in dealing with the issues of trauma is to stay with it. And I'd like to read a quote from Otto Scharmer because I find it very helpful. This is what he says. It may look a little bit as if absencing is the opposite of presencing, but that's not true. In reality, the presencing is grounded in the staying with and in the deeper connection and holding the space. You could say fear is when you get too small and then there's really nothing. And the opposite then is fanaticism. But courage is the holding of the space in between. Presencing is not the opposite of absencing. It's kind of the middle way. There are always two different forms in which absencing can manifest. And that's also true for our current age. I can move too much into anti this and anti that. That's one problem. And how absencing shows up and basically moves into direct violence one way or another. And we see this uptick in violence. But the other form of absencing shows up and is enabled through cynicism, through disconnect, through not caring. That's why staying with it is a real key capacity that we need to build, not only on the level of the individual, but also on the level of the collective. So those are some wise words. And I believe that we probably each have experienced the absencing, where I withdraw because I can't handle it. It becomes a collective numbness. When absencing takes place on a large scale, it's a collective numbing. So the cure for the numbing is to be present, is to stay with it, to be fully present and aware of the reality that's occurring in this very moment. The danger of the numbing of humanity means that we're unable to respond and redeem and heal that which is imprisoning us. And I'm reminded of the Pink Floyd lyrics, I am comfortably numb. That is not a state that we want to find ourselves in, comfortably numb. We need to be fully present and fully willing to deal with what's happening. I'm going to give you what I call the triple A approach. Actually, there are 4 A's, but it's a 3-step A approach. First of all, there's awareness, where we recognize what is present, we take it in, we register it. Then there's acknowledgement and acceptance, where we not only take it in, but we own the responsibility for doing something about it. And then the third step, the third A, is action. We choose to do what is right to heal the wounds. So we have awareness, step 1, acknowledgement and acceptance, step 2, and action, step 3. As I've mentioned, trauma can be carried forward from other lifetimes. Many people, and you may be one of them, I certainly am, who have illogical fears, fear of drowning, fear of dark, narrow passages, fear of knives, fear of whatever it is. Where do they come from? It doesn't matter. What matters is that they are still conditioning us. The past is still conditioning our present. I can give you an example of something that haunted me for a long time. I could never figure out what it was about, and I still don't, but I actually found a way of coming to terms with it. When I lived in Scotland, I lived at the Findhorn community for about 14 years. I'd go out every weekend into the Scottish mountains, out hiking. I was a fairly experienced mountaineer. I'd gone through winter survival training in the Scottish Highlands. I built snow caves and practiced emergency braking with ice axes on steep, slippery slopes, etc. And so I felt myself fairly competent. But there was one particular route that I would take where I would walk up this narrow valley, then start to climb up to the ridge. And there was this little passageway that connected one valley with the other. And this is about 2/5 into the hike. And as I went through this passageway, it wasn't that long, but going through these walls, I froze. And all of a sudden, I was just filled with fear. And I thought, oh my gosh, I better turn back. I better turn back. I can't go forward. It was the most amazing thing. It was totally illogical. And so once I did turn back, but the next time I said, no, I'm going to go through. And so I just said, look, all is fine. You're capable. Be kind to yourself. Let's do this slowly. And so I walked through, went into the valley, and realized that there's still something inside of me that I don't know where it comes from. It still traumatizes me. And all I can do is every time I meet it is to go a little closer with a little bit more love and seek to embrace it and bring it in. So I just use this as an example of something that was illogical because I felt myself to be competent. But in this one particular part of the mountains, I was frozen, not physically frozen, emotionally frozen. And I'm sure each of us have been touched by differing degrees with this kind of trauma over the course of this lifetime. So is there something that creates this for you? And are you willing, when you meet it, you may not have to meet it again, but if you do meet it again, are you willing to walk towards it with love and invite it to come toward you and to go through whatever healing needs to take place? So there's the obvious healing that we have to do as a humanity. It's the healing of the environment that we polluted. It's the healing of the psychic environment, the emotional and mental field that we've polluted with hatred and we've polluted with anger. Those are obvious things. But then there's this unknown trauma that still infects the field that we have to come to terms with. This is the collective trauma. And we have many people who are skilled in these practices and we can turn to. And yet, I'd also believe that we can simply receive help from the subtle realms by asking for it. We're aided in the healing process by the unseen helpers. And one of the more powerful experiences along these lines happened when I was a young boy. And here's the brief story. I lived in the south of England, and the backlit tree outside my bedroom window, when it would blow in the breeze, the leaves would dance and they would cast shadows on my curtains. And they conjured up ancient fears of being attacked by the minions of darkness. It totally created fear in me. And one particular night, it became so overwhelming, so intense. I sat up in bed and I found myself praying. I just prayed and said, help, help me. And something very special happened. Into the room came a luminous presence. And it looked and felt like an angel. I couldn't say it was, but that's what it looked and felt like. And it was carrying a sparkling container of liquid. And this presence stood over me, proceeded to pour the jug over my head, so the contents flowed from my head all the way down my body. And immediately I felt a liquid calm moving down from the top of my head throughout every part of my body, removing fear and replacing it with a deep sense of inner peace. So the ancient fear induced by the dancing shadows on my bedroom curtain never returned. And to this day, I recall the visceral sense of being blessed by an invisible healing helper. So you may have your own experiences. And for me, that was so real. I think I was about 9 or 10. And that feeling is still in my body. And anytime I feel fearful, I go back to that memory and bring it alive, because that angel is still present and still has that healing balm. So I just invite us to turn to all the resources that are available, both visible and invisible. But let's remember that the deep purpose behind the healing of the collective wounds is to create a healthy field in which the love and joy of the human spirit can be born inside a heart that is touched by loving kindness and now cares for the welfare of others, and not just for the survival of the separated self. For me, that's the key. That's the turning point. When we move away from the focus of our lives being the survival of the separated self to the caring of others, then everything shifts and healing can take place. Let me just check to see if there's anything in the chat here. As I say, this is not an intellectual topic. It really is one of exploring what's still alive in us that is blocking the full presence of who we are. And what I believe many of us have realized is that the heart is the place where healing takes place. The heart is the womb in which the birth of this fire of love occurs. And so the heart has to be cultivated. And it seems as though the heart has to first be broken by pain and loss, and then healed by love so that it is activated and becomes what I would call the joyful and fecund field in which the presence of the soul can fully incarnate and shine on earth. So the healing of the world's wounds needs to create this open and loving space inside the collective heart. And once we create that loving space, then we can bring in, through an invocation, the presence of a greater love that is the love that lives inside our soul, that lives inside the soul of our common humanity. So this is what's facing us as a human family. Healing the wounded body so that we can give birth to the presence of love, so that we can live a life where instead of pain and trauma, we enter a healed space where we live and learn through joy and the wisdom that the pain has brought us releases us from the trauma of the past. The reason it's so important is because I believe in the next few years, this great birth is seeking to take place, the birth of the fire of love that is the soul of humanity. And it needs the right conditions to be created for the birth to take place. And a traumatized body is not the condition in which this birth can take place. So I'm holding the trauma and the healing of the collective trauma as the work of preparing the way for this great birth. It's not just about fixing something that's broken. It's about creating wholeness so that the birth of a greater wholeness can take place. And that greater wholeness is the presence of love. I'm not sure what else needs to be said. As I say, this is not a talk on healing the wounds. It's really a time to reflect. And maybe that's what we can do now. Each of us can just take a moment to think, what is it? If you're going back to those 3 A's, what is it that I'm aware of in my life that is calling to me to be healed? What do I acknowledge and now accept? i.e., what do I own as my responsibility? What do I say yes to? And then action. What do I choose to do to set in motion the process of healing, the healing of self, but also the healing of the collective field? Nobody else can do the healing for us. There are healers that can help with the healing, and yet the willingness to be healed has to be present first, I believe, for us. So are we willing as a human family to be healed and to heal ourselves? And are we willing to give birth to something that is more powerful than any energy that's ever been present on this planet before? And that is the power of the fire of love. So I leave us with this opportunity to reflect. And we are still within the influence of the air sign of Gemini. And those of you who are familiar with Gemini and the energy that flows through it, there's one single ray that flows through Gemini, and it's the second ray of love wisdom. And it brings the ability to heal. And because Gemini is a dualistic sign, it's Castor and Pollux, it's the heavenly twins, it's also a sign in which we can help resolve differences, polarities, where we can come to a point of synthesis. And synthesis simply is a place of greater wholeness than before. So maybe what we can do is to take some time now by way of closure, just to go back into our group heart and feel that fire of love at its center. And into that fire of love, we place all the pain, all the wounds, all that needs healing. Because the loving heart is the chalice. It's the crucible that is strong enough to hold the unredeemed elements that need healing. So we visualize inside the chalice of our heart this great alchemical process that we call the healing of collective trauma. And we call upon the healing angels, and we call upon the power of our soul, and we call upon all those helpers, both seen and unseen, who can help us heal our fractured body of humanity, who can bring us to a state of wholeness, so that the full splendor of our humanity can shine forth. Let's hold this vision in our heart as we breathe gently in and out together, breathing life into the vision and breathing love into our world. We sound the Tibetan bowl 3 times, and with each sounding, we commit ourselves to the process of deep healing. We commit ourselves to the process of opening the heart to love. And we commit ourselves to being present every moment as a messenger of love. My sincere wish is that we will support each other in this journey. And whenever we meet someone in stress, just realize that that's how stress is showing up in them, and it shows up in us in different ways. And let us respond to a stressful situation with as much love and compassion as we can muster. And let us realize that the healing of the world is the task in front of each one of us and in front of us as one humanity. So even though there may be pain at the moment, at the same time, with this flame of fiery hope burning, there is this great joy as we await the birth of the fire of love inside the cave of the human heart. Thank you, everyone, for being present for each other, for yourself. And may these coming days bring healing to all beings, to all situations. And for this, we give deep thanks. So, good night from Meditation Mount, and thank you again for your presence and participation.